And start. There we go. Folks see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Yay. All right. Well, thank you all for having me here to talk about the NOFO. And I know some of the folks who are on this committee and who are here today, I know from the last NOFO round, and I know some of you know quite a lot about this funding source, looking at you, Hannah. And I know some folks have served on the NOFO committee or the appeals committee, but that there are others of you who probably don't know very much about the COC funding source. So for some of you, this may be a little bit of a review of things you already know, but I think it's good to just sort of level set and give everyone the same baseline of information. So this is what we call the NOFO is really essentially an annual funding cycle or funding process by which the Alameda County Continuum of Care and all the continuums of care around the country get their dollars from HUD. And it's one of the reasons that we have this thing called the Continuum of Care Leadership Board, and all of the subcommittees that are underneath it is part of, I mean, it exists for a lot of other reasons, but one reason it exists is so that Alameda County can access its share of HUD COC funding. So what I want to cover, I'm going to hopefully not talk for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. That's my goal. And then take questions, and I'm hoping we can have kind of a lively Q&A. So just my agenda is just to quickly kind of explain why we're covering this in the youth committee, because it has to do with a request from the NOFO committee. I'm going to give kind of a high level overview of this particular funding source, and then an overview of how we run the competition locally in Alameda County, or have historically run it. And all of these are topics, or this number 2 and number 3 were all, you know, we sent out some information ahead of time. It was a lot of materials. I don't know if folks had a chance to read it, but everything I'm covering is in those materials we sent out. And then also, Chris, I'm hoping we can send these slides out after the meeting as well.
Absolutely.
So folks don't need to worry too much about taking notes if you, you know, unless you absolutely want to, but you'll have these slides for yourselves as well. Okay, so this is like probably the most dense of all the slides. Apologies, it has a lot of words on it, but so essentially the NOFO committee, with guidance from the leadership board and the strategy funding and compliance committee, the NOFO committee is really responsible for overseeing the annual application process. And so 2 years ago in 2022, 2023, the NOFO committee invited the racial equity committee, which was just kind of getting started at that time, to take a look at the local application process with a kind of an equity lens and make some recommendations about what we could do to make sure the process is equitable. And that committee made some recommendations about changing the way we ask some of the questions in the application, to make sure that they were not so open-ended and subjective. And so we changed the process a little bit in 2023 to ask some more slightly more objective questions about how organizations are advancing racial equity in their work. So what the NOFO committee came up with in 2023 was, hey, maybe it would be a good idea if we did the same kind of process and invite the youth committee, which is just getting started, to take a look at the process and particularly the evaluation factors, and think about it from a kind of a youth eye, to think about how well the process is considering and evaluating youth serving projects, and even really all the projects, with an eye to how well they're thinking about how they serve youth. So the NOFO committee really wanted to ask this committee to take a look at last year's competition process and let the NOFO committee know if you thought there were some changes that would be important to make. One thing I'll just add that's not on the slide, but last year when the NOFO committee finished all of its rating and ranking, quite a few of the youth serving projects were among the lower scoring projects in the continuum. And so we want to just make sure that there's not some way that the process is sort of unintentionally skewing to make it harder for youth serving projects to score well. So that was just sort of another reason that the NOFO committee wanted to have that kind of back and forth with this group. But in order to ask you to make those recommendations, we thought it would be helpful if you kind of had an overview of the process. So that's why we're starting with this presentation today. And I would also just add, I think, you know, we're going to have some discussion at the end, but if folks have questions as I'm going along, you should feel free to put them in the chat, and or you could just raise your hand, and I'm happy to take questions as we go along if that's helpful for folks. Okay, I don't see any hands yet. So I'm going to just kind of quickly give an overview of the continuum of care funding source. Some of these things, as I mentioned, I think a few of you have probably already heard before, but just to start with a few acronyms that come up a lot. Of course, everyone knows continuum of care, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. HUD, of course, is our funder, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They're the ones who give us the continuum of care funding. And then the NOFO, used to be called NOFA, is the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is a kind of a generic term. Lots of different funders put out NOFOs, but in the context of the COC, when we say NOFO, we're talking about the annual release of funds that HUD puts out. It used to be Notice of Funding Availability, and just to make life difficult, they decided to change it to Opportunity. So I think you also may know this as well, but the continuum of care term is a term invented by HUD, and it means 3 different things. So it is the planning body in a community that addresses homelessness. So as I mentioned, the continuum of care membership and the leadership board and all the committees together are the continuum of care planning structure. The continuum of care also means the funding source that helps fund the activities in the community that are addressing homelessness. And then it also means the system of services and housing that provide interventions to help address homelessness among people who are experiencing homelessness. So it's can be kind of confusing what we're talking about when we say continuum of care, but the way I'm talking about it in this presentation is the second one, which is the continuum of care funding, continuum of care dollars. And I would just add that I think it's an incredibly complicated funding source. There are many other funding sources that the federal government disperses down to communities. There are other funding sources the state has. A couple of them came up on the YAB update, like the HAP funding. And there's so many funding sources that are easier to understand and easier to use than the COC funding. It's probably the most complicated, which is why we have to do things like give orientation sessions. People can have a kind of framework for thinking about how to best distribute the dollars. So the general process is got a lot of steps, and it's way more steps than other funding sources have. But HUD every year, usually in the summer, puts out their NOFO, which is their announcement that funding is available, and that includes all the sort of rules that have to be followed. And then every continuum of care, of which there are more than 400 in the United States, has to develop a local process to invite projects in the local community to apply for funding. Those local projects don't apply to HUD, they apply to the continuum of care. And then the continuum of care has to rate and rank them and decide which ones are going to get submitted to HUD. So once that local process is done, the continuum of care packages it all up in what we call the consolidated application and sends that off to HUD. And so in that packaging up of it, there is a ranked sorting of the projects. So the community gets to say which ones are the priority ones and which ones are lower down the list. And that has a big impact on what does and doesn't get funded. But HUD also makes some decisions about what gets funded. So it's So we send our list, but we don't necessarily get everything on the list funded. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little further down. But so the local process has a huge impact on what projects in Alameda County get COC funding, but it's all kind of structured by HUD's rules and also how much money they have available. And then once HUD has looked at the consolidated application and looked at all the other consolidated applications from around the country, they announce the awards. And then they execute grants directly with the projects. So in other words, they don't give the money to the continuum of care, they give it directly to the applicant projects. And all of this takes about 6 months. So they usually put out the NOFO in the summer. It's usually due towards the end of September back to HUD, and they don't usually announce the awards till January, or actually this year, I think they announced them. Yeah, late January, they usually announce them. So it's even more than 6 months for the whole cycle to happen. So we just got the announcements a few weeks ago about the 2023 competition, and we're expecting the 2024 competition will start. We're expecting the NOFO probably in July of 2024, so pretty soon. So one reason this is significant is we get a lot of money. Alameda County gets quite a lot of money. So in 2023, we don't know what we'll be able to apply for yet in 2024. But in 2023, we had the opportunity to apply for almost $51 million. And I just want to make sure this is an important point, that a big chunk of what money is available is really available to continue to fund existing projects. So what we call renewals, meaning projects that already have this funding, and they just want it, and they have it for 1 year. And so every year they have to kind of re-up their grant. So of the 50 million that had made available last year, 41 million of it was to fund renewals. And then another 3 million was for YHDP renewals, which is just a slightly different category of renewal. So they don't offer a lot of money to pay for new things. So last year we were able to apply for about 3 million for new housing projects, and another 1.5 million for new housing projects for victims of domestic violence, or domestic violence survivors, excuse me. And then we were able to apply for 1.5 million for planning dollars. Now, you can take money away from renewal grants and give them to new grants, which is something that's called reallocation. It's not an option that this continuum of care has chosen to use very much, because if you take dollars away from an existing project, you're essentially you're taking housing beds out of the system, or taking housing from that project, including beds that people are staying in. So generally speaking, reallocation has been used in a pretty limited way in Alameda County, but in theory, you could take the money for the renewal grants and give it to new projects and create a bigger number of new projects. Whoops. Oh, this is doing this. Sorry, I didn't realize this slide is the kind you have to click through. So just some high level stuff about what you can fund with this money. You have to serve, the projects have to serve people who meet HUD's definition of homelessness. You can specialize in a subpopulation. So you can have a project, for example, that serves youth, or serves veterans, or serves families with children. You can provide housing mostly through master leasing or rental assistance, although there's some other options. You can pay for services as long as they're connected to housing, and you can pay for system infrastructure. So coordinated entry and the HMIS data system are things you can pay for with this funding source. And then there's a lot of things you cannot use it for, including, most significantly, emergency self-shelter is not an allowable use. You can't pay for any services that are not connected to housing units. You can't pay for new transitional housing, except there's a small exception to that if it's combined with rapid rehousing, which I'll explain in a few minutes. And you pay for homelessness prevention. So it's really limited to housing projects that are permanent housing or rapid rehousing. And you can also combine rapid rehousing with transitional housing. And then pretty much any kind of organization can apply for funding. It can be a nonprofit. It can be a local government entity like a city. The county is eligible to apply. It can be a housing authority that applies, and tribes and tribal entities can also apply. And then these are the project types that I just mentioned, which just gives a little bit more detail. So one of the reasons this funding source is, you know, it's a lot of money, $50 million, but a lot of it is already going into permanent supportive housing projects that exist. And permanent supportive housing is housing where the participants don't have any time limit on receiving assistance. So like housing vouchers that are not time limited, so you get the subsidy for as long as you need it. So a lot of those renewal projects that I was talking about are permanent supportive housing. So a lot of that money goes to sustaining people who were at one time experiencing homelessness but are now housed and keeping them in their housing, which is very important. But just to be clear that like the $50 million, when we think about that bucket of money, it's not like, unfortunately, not $50 million to do a bunch of new things. A lot of it goes to keeping all our permanent supportive housing portfolio running in Alameda County. You can also pay for rapid rehousing, and we have quite a few rapid rehousing grants in the COC portfolio of projects. So those are projects where you can get up to 24 months of rental assistance, after which the household has to take over the rent on their own. And then these joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing projects are basically projects where you can fund like a site-based interim housing project where people go and can move into a transitional bed, but then when they leave, they get a rapid rehousing subsidy. So it kind of combines a transitional housing bed with the ability to give people medium-term rental assistance when they leave. And we have probably 4 or 5 of those joint transitional / rapid rehousing grants currently in the continuum. Sorry, I was just noticing that there are comments in the chat that I did not see, so sorry. I'll just stop here and answer these. So Tammy, what is considered homelessness prevention? Homelessness prevention is if you have a household or a person that's in a rental unit and they are at risk of losing that unit. So they may have gotten an eviction notice or they're behind in their rent. So you unfortunately cannot use COC dollars to pay for rental costs of people who are already in housing. So it can only be spent to pay for housing costs for people who are experiencing homelessness, meaning they're literally unsheltered or they're in a shelter bed. And then, yeah, Kantane's asking, is it possible to receive a copy of the presentation? Yes, we'll send it out as soon as the meeting's over. We would have sent it out ahead of time, but I forgot to send it to Chris yesterday. And then Sarah saying, wow, to what?
To what you spoke to about the homelessness prevention.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's just crazy to me. Like yeah. I mean, it speaks for itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way HUD thinks about it is there are other funding sources that can be spent for prevention. And so this funding source has been around since the 1980s, and they've always sort of really tried to, for the most part, use it to prioritize interventions that help people who have already unfortunately lost their housing and are unhoused and are outside, or maybe they're in an emergency shelter bed. So that's really kind of where it's targeted. HUD has a funding stream called ESG, Emergency Solutions Grant, which you can use for prevention, and you can also use for emergency shelter. Unfortunately, it doesn't have enough, there's not enough money in it, but that's their other funding source.
Thank you for that.
So this is basically exactly what I just said. So the primary target for COC funding is people experiencing what HUD calls literal homelessness, meaning they're outside on the street, in a tent, in a park, in a vehicle, an RV that's not hooked up, or an abandoned building that doesn't have utilities, in an emergency shelter, or in a motel if they're receiving like a motel voucher, or if they're in an institutional setting but were experiencing homelessness when they went in. And then you can also serve households that are fleeing domestic violence. So you can't use it for people who are housed or unstably housed. For example, people who are couch surfing or doubled up. People in sober living and room and board are considered by HUD to be housed, or if they're staying in a motel with their own resources, HUD considers them to be housed. And then I think this is of relevance to this group. So you are allowed to target specific subpopulations as long as you're careful not to violate any anti-discrimination laws. And then so that it's pretty common to have COC funded projects that target youth, families with children, domestic violence survivors, veterans, people with different kinds of disabling conditions. So it's pretty flexible in that sense. It's not so flexible in some other senses, but it's fairly flexible in the subpopulation that can be served. And then just a couple other things. Projects that receive this particular funding source have to take their referrals through coordinated entry. They have to align to HUD Housing First requirements, which are about having fairly low barriers to entry, and then also relatively limited grounds for termination. So basically, you know, doing everything possible to make sure people are able to participate and aren't terminated from participation in a program and having to go back to experiencing homelessness. They have to enter everybody into HMIS. There's some data quality standards and record keeping requirements. And then the match for this particular funding source is it's 4-to-1. So it's not like a huge amount of match, but in order to use these resources, the applicant has to come up with some matching dollars. I think that's the last. Yeah. So that's that's like a lot of information. So I'll just stop there for a sec and see if folks have other questions. I'm going to look at the chat too. Do we know how often HUD reviews project eligibility requirements? Like when was the last time that was updated? So that's a great question. So the answer to that, so HUD is in theory supposed to go out and monitor all these projects. And in the old days, I've been doing this work for a long time, there used to be more staff at HUD at the local field offices, and they would send staff from HUD Region 9, which is in San Francisco, out to kind of really take a look at what's going on in the funded projects. They don't do that much anymore. They do a little bit, but it's not nearly so frequent because the field offices don't have the staffing they used to. So what's happened instead is actually they've asked the Continuum of Cares to take on that monitoring function. So the COC is actually supposed to be out there taking a look at whether projects are complying with HUD's requirements. And that's a whole new piece of work that the strategy funding and compliance committee is looking at, is kind of getting a regular monitoring process rolling. And the other thing I would just say is one thing HUD does is in the annual application that the projects have to fill out, the application for funding, it does ask them about their Housing First compliance, but it's a pretty light, like it just has some check boxes and the project just checks to say, yes, we don't have barriers, and that's kind of all that gets checked. but in theory, it gets checked once a year. And Tammy, I don't know if there were other kinds of eligibility things you're interested in knowing, whether they get looked at or updated.
Yeah, I might have more questions later, which I'll probably email to you, but thank
Okay.
you. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One thing that has come up a lot in the NOFO committee, so I've supported the NOFO committee last year and the year before. And about half, maybe more than half of the folks on that committee are have lived experience and have actually participated in some of these programs as clients. And a lot of what comes up for them is like, you know, we're being asked to look at these funding applications from like, there's like 38, no, there's more than 40 renewal projects. So there are 40 existing projects out there that are asking to have their dollars renewed. And the committee often just asks kind of like, how do we know they're really doing a good job? Like what is the mechanism for evaluating beyond just that they have to submit this funding application every year? And so I think that is where this idea of having more of a year-round monitoring process comes up. And I think will be really important going forward. And I think hopefully that will also include some component for asking participants to share their experiences and their evaluation and whether they think, you know, the program was living up to the expectations that they had. So what other questions do folks have about the overall funding? Anything else? I know it's a lot, it's a ton of information. Okay, well, if anything else comes up, just stop me. So I'm just going to talk, I have maybe 10 more minutes about the local process. I have a lot fewer slides about this, but just wanted to kind of orient you to how we have done it historically in Alameda County. So this is that same slide I just showed. Hannah says there are no stupid questions. Ask away. So just a reminder that, so when we talk about the local process, we're talking about these two middle boxes. So, you know, HUD gives us sort of the rules of the road, like here's the money that's available, here's this year's set of rules, and then the continuum of care has to come up with how they want to run the local process. And that's mostly the job of the NOFO committee, although the SFC, which is the strategy and compliance committee, and the leadership board gives some kind of overall guidance to the NOFO committee, but then the NOFO committee kind of develops the timeline, the policy for how we want to solicit applications, and then probably the most important thing that they do is they decide on the scoring rubric. So they decide how are we going to score these applications, and then what questions are we asking in the application form so that we get the information we need. So this is what I should have advanced my slide. So the HUD releases the NOFO. It includes the amount of funding available and some instructions, and then it gives the overarching rules the COC has to follow in designing the local application process. And then for the local competition, so that's what we have control over, we design a local process aligned to HUD's requirements. HUD requires that every project that applies locally has to be evaluated, scored, and ranked, and it has to be a transparent set of criteria that are publicly available. And you have to have one process for both renewal projects and new projects. So everybody flows into one process, whether they're trying to renew their existing funding or get new funding. And the COC has a fair amount of latitude in how we design the process. HUD does require that the scoring criteria should be as objective as possible, but you are allowed to include some subjective factors. And one other thing they require is for renewals, so projects that exist already, and some of them have existed for a long time, you have to take a look at their project performance by looking at their HMIS data. So the kinds of things that typically are looked at are, have all the beds been filled? So has the project had strong occupancy? Are participants gaining income when they exit? Are participants securing permanent housing when they exit? Some of those kinds of things are kind of required to be looked at as part of the scoring process. And so we use that by drawing on HMIS data.
I wanted to ask something on the last one. This is like
Oh, did I lose you, Ray, or did you?
Ray, you're breaking up.
Okay. Oh.
We can't hear you, Ray. Can you put your question in the chat?
for organizations that
Ray, if you want to put your question in the chat, Kate can answer it that way.
Oh, he says it's okay. All right, well, if you have a chance to do that, or we could circle back if you're able to get your, I think it might be your cell phone, I think, is cutting out.
It looks like he said, I wanted to ask if these are the scores for... No, ask Ray if these are the scores for...
Oops, sorry. For scoring for different organizations.
Okay,
So
yes, like on the local level.
yeah, on
The
the local
organization.
level, we establish scoring criteria at the project level. So for example, so one organization might have multiple grants, and a lot of them do. For the Alameda County OHCC has a lot of grants. There's some of the nonprofit agencies have multiple grants. So they're not evaluated at the agency level, they're evaluated at the project level. I can't remember what's the second part of the question. Now I lost there's the chat. Yes, so then we try to use as much as we can objective factors especially for renewals. It's a little different with new projects because you're trying to score something that doesn't exist yet. So it's a proposed project. So you don't really have performance data to look at. So those tend to be evaluated a little bit more subjectively, and actually I'm going to show the scoring criteria in a sec. The other thing that's really important to know, and why all of this is I think I would just say describe it as kind of a stressful situation for the renewal applicants in particular, is so all the projects come in and they all get scored and then they get put in a rank order. And generally, HUD requires that some of the ones at the bottom are put into what HUD calls tier 2. And the tier 2 ones aren't guaranteed that they'll get their dollars. So the way it's kind of structured by HUD, there's sort of no way to get around putting some of the renewing projects into tier 2. So they get sent, the list gets sent to HUD, and the ones that are tier 2 have to wait like usually 3 or 4 months to know if they're going to get their grant renewed. And occasionally they don't. So last year in 2022, there was one renewal project that did not get funded because they were put near the bottom of the list, which was extremely unfortunate, but we didn't have any way to not put renewal projects in tier 2. Then in 2023, we had a higher, for whatever reason, everything that went into tier 2 did get funded. But there's always a little bit of anxiety around having projects in tier 2. And so how the renewal projects get scored is very significant. So just sort of what are the criteria? What are we evaluating things on? How do we truly kind of figure out which projects we think are the better performers is really important, because the ones we decide are the lower performers could lose their dollars. Even though we don't want them to lose their dollars, but we don't really have a choice around that. So the whole tiering element of this is significant. And again, it's why I think everyone is really trying to take a careful look at how we're going about doing it. The project on the 2023 priority list, the very lowest ranking renewal project was a youth serving project from the city of Oakland. They did end up getting funded, but it was just sort of, it was noted at the time that like we're putting this project that serves youth at the very bottom of the list. So this just kind of gives you like an overview of what the cycle looks like. So HUD puts the NOFO out usually in June or July. The SFC committee gives some high level strategic direction to the leadership board, which then approves it, which then means the NOFO committee can come up with the local process, policies, scoring factors, and timeline. Then we open the competition. So usually that's about 3 weeks or so after the NOFO comes out. So we have the local competition open, we have a bidders conference, so all the agencies are invited to come learn about this year's cycle. They usually get about 3 weeks to submit their local applications. Unfortunately, they don't get a ton of time. And then continuing on, there's some kind of threshold review and some objective scoring that happens that is done by me and by Homebase because it's just doing math. And then the NOFO committee reads all the applications and scores all the subjective factors. And then they have a day-long meeting that goes on from like 9 to 4, where they put all the scores together and develop the final list of projects, including agreeing on what is going to be in that tier 2. Then the applicants are notified they have an opportunity to appeal if any mistakes were made. And then the leadership board approves the final list, which is usually done in mid-September. And then the whole thing goes to HUD in late September. And then I think the last thing, so this just talks a little bit about how we have historically thought about scoring for these projects. And so this is what the scoring factors were in 2023, but it's been very similar in prior years. So it isn't brand new in 2023. Everything's scored on a 100-point scale, including both the new projects and the renewal projects. Like I mentioned, the renewal projects are evaluated based on their past performance, and the new projects are evaluated based on what they're proposing to do and also the track record of the applicant. So something that's important, I think, for this group to know in particular is the criteria aren't different for different populations that are served. So they're population neutral. So if you're serving a youth, or you're serving veterans, or you're serving, you know, people with mental health conditions, everyone gets scored on the same set of factors. The only differences among the factors is there's some very slight differences between the permanent supportive housing and the rapid and transitional housing factors, mostly around how they think about performance on some of the housing measures. So permanent supportive housing gets scored on whether people stay housed, and rapid rehousing and transitional housing scored on whether people exit to housing. So it's just some slight differences. And then the projects that fund coordinated entry and HMIS don't get scored because they're not actually serving clients directly. And then the YHDP projects right now are not being scored, but they will eventually roll into being competitively scored, probably not this year, but next year. And that's because they're new. So they were just awarded and they've only just sort of started getting going. So this just kind of gives you a high level overview of what the factors are. And I think some of the materials that were sent out before the meeting has all the detail about these, and I'm happy to answer a question about these as well. So for renewals, so again, for projects that already exist, 54 out of the 100 points are based on performance. So how well did they perform in relation to certain benchmarks? There's 6 points around how they participate in coordinated entry and how they serve participants with high service needs. There's 16 points around how the project is advancing racial equity and how they're meaningfully involving people with lived expertise of homelessness. Then there's 12 points around whether they're doing good grants management. So are they getting their reports in on time? Are they drawing down dollars on time? Are they fully utilizing all their grant dollars? That's a huge factor. And one thing that has come up a lot is projects losing points because they didn't spend all their money. There's some points around organizational capacity, and then usually we give some incentive points if projects want to voluntarily reallocate any of their dollars back to the pot. And then I think this is my last one. On the new projects, it's pretty different because there's no sort of past performance. So there's 30 points around how the proposed project will address local and HUD priorities. There's 36 points around whether the applicant can show good performance on a comparable project that already exists. 16 points around the budget and whether it's cost effective and leverages other resources, and then 18 points for the applicant capacity. And I think that's it. That's my last slide. And I'm gonna unshare this. I can put it back up if people have questions about specific items. So maybe Hannah can tell us what it's been like to go through this process, because she got to go through it last year.
I was just gonna say, well, first and foremost, I just want to uplift you, Kate, because oh my God, it's just so much. Like I had to do all the YHCP project renewals last year and had no idea that I had to do them. And number two, like just what that even meant. And it's like 60 pages. It's kind of it brought me to like college application like trauma. I don't know, but it was like it's a lot, you know, and I only had 4 projects to renew with YGP. So what Kate does with Riley and other folks in our that do support the NOFO process is go through all of the applications. So like she said, there's like 40 plus, right, in our whole continuum. So it's really, and like I said, each project is like a 40 to 60 page application with like, you know, how much are the matches? What is the congressional district? What are the like special activity? Who are the like lots and lots of information that you're like, I have no idea, but you figure it out. And look, and I was like, Kate, I need help. And she was so gracious. And like, I just had to block like a week last summer. Like, I got to figure this out. And Kate just always came through to help me like, oh, this is how you do this, or this is how you do that. It's on a portal called eSnaps, which is one of HUD's lovely portals. Very archaic and very like you have to fill out like, again, there's like different tabs. You have to get the budget, the matches, all of the things. And so it's a huge lift, obviously, because it's millions and millions of dollars, right? And so it's important. It makes sense. So that's on the back end, and then on the front, like again, I think it's really great that well, one, this is a lot of information to take in now, so folks might just be like and not know what questions to ask, even though just ask whatever. But the NOFO process, it's exciting that some of you all will be able to be a part of the NOFO committee and like review projects, right? And so get more familiar with the resources in our continuum, while those of us that like manage the contracts and the grants on the back end are doing the renewals and then, you know, Kate, I don't know if you're doing it again this year, is helping us coordinate as a whole continuum to put our whole entire application to HUD, right? And then so yeah, it's a big deal. It's a lot of work, but it's also like how we're funding our housing resources and programs. So I'm happy to answer questions too if folks have any. Again, I know it's a lot of information. It's can feel overwhelming. But yeah, there's like this this like countrywide process, right, that all continuums of care are going through to apply to our federal housing and urban development department for this funding. And then there's like the local level where we're deciding like, you know, what has been working and what hasn't been working based on the performance of projects and programs, and who do we want to uplift to HUD to continue to support.
Yeah. Can I also say something? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, you're
Yeah.
back.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say that I really like the NOFO process and the appeals, because like you guys said, like you get to see what worked and what didn't work. And I think when I was on that voting, just looking at the programs that worked and didn't work, that's exactly what I thought. Like if I put myself in a position where I needed resources, and then you're looking at like the breakdown of everything they did. They're telling you all the information about how the program works and how it like supports different stuff. So like I was really happy to be a part of it. And I'm looking forward to being a part of it again. So just wanted to say that. It's
Great.
fun.
And then when does NOFO committee, just talk, since we're talking about that, when does that start getting put together?
So this year we're going to do something a little different, which is so typically the NOFO committee doesn't start to meet until the NOFO comes out or just before, but we're going to convene what we're calling a NOFO work group, which will include NOFO committee and some other committees are being invited to name members to kind of do some pre-work. And some of that rolls into what we're talking about here, which is like we want to get out a little bit ahead of the NOFO this year and really take a close look at how especially the scoring factors have worked and what the application form looks like, and sort of maybe make some plans of how we're going to adjust it sooner. And once the NOFO comes, it's an incredible time crunch because HUD only gives you 90 days to respond usually, and there's not time to think about too much. So I mean, there's not really time to make a lot of big decisions. So it would be better if we could get some of that stuff teed up beforehand. So I think, and Esther's sort of overseeing that piece, but we're hoping to get that NOFO work group rolling, very soon. Like maybe it won't be able to meet in February, but by March, it should be able to meet.
We have 2 members of the youth committee who are going to be on that NOFO work group as well. So just in terms of ensuring we're continuing to have that youth voice and youth presence throughout the NOFO process, we have the entire youth committee able to provide input, which this is that start, but the NOFO work group itself will also include Sarah and Tammy on behalf of the youth committee.
I just wanted to say also, there's a comment in the chat from Marisol about she's saying with an equity lens, I can see how smaller organizations might have a disadvantage if they have limited staffing capacity to, do the application, and is there technical assistance available? So the answer is yes. So historically, we've always offered a COC 101 briefing, kind of similar to what I just did, but a little longer, that we try to do like a little bit before the NOFO comes out. And then we do offer one-on-one TA to organizations that are interested in applying, just to sort of help them understand all the HUD requirements and how the portal works. I think the big challenge for smaller groups that might be working with people who experience homelessness is that the funding is very limited in terms of the kind of project that can get funded. So in other words, if you do services, but you're not actually operating housing units, you can't apply for that. And if you do interim housing, you actually can't apply for that either. So you have to be sort of in a place as an organization where you're able to manage a rental assistance program, which is rapid rehousing, and or manage a permanent supportive housing program. So that kind of tends to, unfortunately, it just means that some of the smaller organizations working in this space, because they don't really have a housing project they want to apply for, or maybe they're interested in getting into doing housing, but it's a pretty big undertaking from an organizational capacity standpoint. It's just a hard funding source to use, because you can't use it for very many kinds of things. So that's been my experience of what the barrier is, because we will typically have organizations come to the orientation and then they start to talk about what it is they want to ask for funding for. And we just have to say, you can't use this funding source for that. Like it just, HUD won't let you. And so that's kind of one of the, that's really a big constraint for folks. And I wish it was not the case, but that is sort of just what it is. And the thing that's ironic about that, I also say, is HUD also is trying to encourage continuums of care to bring new organizations into the CSC and to fund projects, particularly in communities where there are, communities that are kind of demographically aligned to the demographics of people who experience homelessness, and sort of smaller grassroots organizations that might work with those populations. But then they say, well, but we actually won't fund most of the work that you do. Like the kinds of things you do are not eligible for this funding source. So it's a little bit of a catch-22, honestly.